This is our third October episode of Too Close to Home, a series in which we feature creepy stories, ghosts, and mysteries close to the homes of some of our patrons. In this episode, Danielle, Laurie, Geoffrey, Beaver, and Michael are the stars, so we hope you enjoy. Our first story is for Danielle, who lives in Gouverneur, New York. It looks at Bolt Castle near Alexandria Bay, which is located around 30 miles from Gouverneur. The tale of how Bolt Castle came to be built is both heartwarming and tragic. It begins with a German immigrant named George C. Bolt, who came to the US in 1864 and worked as a dishwasher in New York City. Later he worked in Philadelphia, where the owner of an executive club took a liking to him and hired him to be manager of the club's dining room. Soon George fell in love with the boss's daughter, Louise Kerrer, and they married. Together they transformed the Bellevue Stratford into a premier hotel in Philadelphia, attracting the attention of William Waldorf Astor, who asked George to design, co-own, and manage the original Waldorf Hotel that eventually became the famous Waldorf Astoria. Together, George and Louise revolutionized the hotel industry by creating a luxurious visitor experience, and George is credited with inventing room service and residents' fine dining. In 1990, while George was vacationing with his family on the Thousand Islands, he was inspired to build a castle for Louise. He purchased Hart Island, spelled H-A-R-T, and changed the spelling to Hart, H-E-A-R-T. He even modified the land to look like a heart, and modelled the castle on the Rhineland castles of his German homeland. The castle was to be an exquisite 127-room building that he intended to gift to Louise on Valentine's Day 1905. But the castle would never be completed. His dream came to a crashing halt in 1904 when Louise died suddenly. Bolt was so heartbroken that he couldn't bear to finish the castle without her, so he abandoned it and never returned. For 73 years, the castle was left to the elements and vandals, reducing the once incredible building to a derelict shell. It wasn't until 1977 that the Thousand Islands Bridge Authority acquired the castle and has been restoring it to its former glory. Today, this stunning castle is considered one of the greatest examples of historic preservation ever. However, when tragedy and love mix, it often leaves behind the spirits of those who feel cheated out of their life together, and Bolt Castle is no exception. Over the years, people have reported hearing phantom footsteps, strange lights and sounds in the castle. But by far the most frequently reported phenomena is witnessing the spectre of Louise Bolt, who was first spotted just months after her death, apparently looking around the unfinished castle that was meant to be her new home. Since then, and particularly after the castle's restoration, Louise has been seen walking around the castle. She appears as a lady in a white flowing dress who is seemingly inspecting the renovations, and some believe that the reconstruction has reawakened her restless spirit. Others have reportedly heard Louise's footsteps inside the building. Over the years, an alternative rumour has circulated that would explain why Louise was seen at the castle just months after her death. It's proposed that Louise didn't die, instead she ran off with another man, and returned to the castle both in life and in death, racked with guilt over her betrayal to the man who adored her. Have you ever visited Danielle? And if so, we'd love to hear if you've ever had experiences there. Pikeville in Kentucky is notable as the birthplace of a couple of famous country singers, such as Dwight Yoakam and Patti Loveless, and is famous for its Hillbilly Days annual festival that draws crowds of over 100,000. It's also the home of Laurie, and for Laurie, we will look at the tragic story of Octavia Hatcher. James Hatcher was one of the wealthiest, most renowned businessmen ever to live in the small town of Pikeville, Kentucky. He owned several successful businesses in the coal mining and timber industry, as well as many properties. But behind the wealth, James had to live with a tragedy that he never got over. In 1889, Hatcher married Octavia Smith, and within a year, Octavia gave birth to a son they called Jacob. Tragically, Jacob died shortly after he was born in January 1891. It is likely he died from an illness that could be treated today, but back in the 1890s, a minor infection without vaccines or medication could easily take the life of an infant. After the baby's death, Octavia sank into a deep depression and took to her bed. As she became weaker, she succumbed to an unknown illness and slipped into a coma from which she couldn't be awakened. On May 2nd, 1891, Octavia was pronounced dead from a mystery illness. At the time of her death, it was unusually hot weather, and as embalming was not yet common practice, no time was wasted in conducting Octavia's funeral and burying her in the local churchyard. Several days after she was laid to rest, the residents of Pikeville began to exhibit similar symptoms to Octavia, before falling into a coma. But soon they started waking and recovering from their illness, thought to have been caused by the bite of an insect. We now know this is the tsetse fly. James Hatcher and his family began to worry that Octavia might have also been suffering from the same sleep sickness, and a dreadful thought crossed their minds. Had they buried Octavia alive? James quickly arranged an emergency exhumation of Octavia's coffin, and as the lid was lifted, the horrific truth was clear to see. Octavia had woken from her coma to find herself trapped beneath the ground. In a panic, she had torn the lining from the lid of her coffin. Her nails were bloody and her face was contorted in terror. For a second time, Octavia was buried, but James was never the same. He had a life-size, lifelike monument to Octavia built over her grave, and in one arm, the statue held a baby, representative of Jacob. James later built the Hatcher Hotel, at such an angle that he could look up to the cemetery at his young wife, and she could symbolically look down on him. The hotel was known for James's favourite sayings and quotes, which he printed on the walls of the hotel lobby, and a small museum was in one room of the reception area, displaying, among other things, an iron lung, the newest piece of medical technology of its day. Also on display was James Hatcher's own casket, which he had specifically crafted years before his death. This coffin was special. It latched on the inside and had to be sealed with a special tool that would then be pulled out when the body was buried. Not surprisingly, James lived with a severe phobia of being buried alive, which is called tap-up phobia. But the stories don't stop there. Over the years, vandals desecrated the Hatcher cemetery plot and broke the arm holding the baby from the statue, and now the infant lies on the ground at Jacob's grave near the foot of his mother. In the 1990s, over 100 years after Octavia's death, the Hatcher family erected a fence around the plot in an attempt to keep future vandalism from occurring, and the statue was placed on a new marble base so it would be less accessible. This has stopped the vandals, but it hasn't stopped the belief that Octavia haunts the area. Locals have reported hearing the sounds of a kitten crying coming from the area. However, when they investigated, the sound stopped. Others have heard a woman crying coming from the same area, and many who have taken photographs of the plot have looked back on the image and noticed a strange mist that wasn't there at the time. However, the most common story about Octavia is that on the anniversary of her death, the statue will turn away and face the opposite direction. Perhaps the twice-buried woman just wants to be finally left in peace. Today, the Hatcher Hotel is the East Kentucky Exposition Center. Have you ever been in this area, Laurie? Geoffrey George. Hamilton is a small river town on the mighty Mississippi, located on the Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois border. It is also the home of Geoffrey, one of our patrons. We have to admit, it was a little difficult to find anything too creepy in Hamilton, Geoffrey, but we did come across an interesting story from Hamilton that was posted online back in 2003. It is tragic, but also so similar to many other stories we have been sent about people whose spirits have been tortured by the circumstances of their death, so he thought it was worth telling. 3 brothers from Hamilton both had homes next to each other along Highway 136, on the east edge of Hamilton. One of the brothers and his wife, who we'll call Bob and Lucy, lived in a split-level home, and it was them who experienced the haunting that began in the summer of 2003. That year was a hot summer, and in the middle of July, at times the temperature soared above 100 degrees for several days in a row, and it was on one of these sweltering hot July days that it all began. Bob and Lucy ran a small country newspaper in Hamilton, located about 1 mile up the highway from their house. On this particular day, Lucy left the office at 5 p.m. and got into her car to drive home. As she drove, she could see 2 cars travelling directly behind her. As Lucy approached the driveway to her house, she put on her turn signal and slowed down to pull into the drive. However, the 3rd car in the sequence did not realise she was slowing down and slammed into the back of the 2nd vehicle. And as it made impact, it shoved the car into the opposite lane, right in the path of an oncoming tractor-trailer. The impact of the semi-truck thrusted the car into Bob and Lucy's front yard, less than 25 yards from their front door. Luckily, Lucy's car was not hit, and she pulled into her driveway, immediately calling 911, then calling Bob, who came home immediately. When Bill arrived shortly after, he ran up to the crashed car to see if he could be of assistance, but it was very apparent that all 4 of the people travelling in the car were dead. Fortunately, nobody was injured in the other car or the semi that was involved in the accident. A few minutes later, police and emergency vehicles arrived and secured the scene. After a short time, the Illinois State Police informed Bob that 2 cars involved in the accident that were behind Lucy were all members of the same family. They were travelling together in 2 separate cars. The parents and grandparents were travelling in the car that all 4 were killed in. The other car, in which no one was injured, were the children of the family. The police asked Bill if he could take the distraught children of the dead family into his house, so they didn't have to witness the gruesome task of excavating the dead bodies of their parents and grandparents from the mangled car in his front yard. Bob readily agreed and took the 3 children down into his basement to shield them. Their ages ranged from 9 to 18, and they were obviously very upset and in a state of shock. But Lucy and Bob tried their best to calm and console them. A couple hours later, when the accident scene had been cleared, the police collected the 3 children. Lucy and Bill felt sad but relieved that the nightmare for them was over. However, little did they realise it had only just begun. It's worth pointing out that Bob and Lucy are very down-to-earth people, and neither of them had ever believed in the supernatural, the paranormal, or ghosts. But 2 days after the accident, Bob came home to the house in the middle of the afternoon and was surprised to find one of the upstairs bedroom windows opened. Because of the heat at the time, all the windows were kept shut, so the air conditioning was effective. Bob didn't think much about it and shut the window, then double-checked the rest of the house to make sure no other windows were open. He then went to the newspaper office and asked Lucy why she had opened the bedroom window at home with the air conditioning on. Lucy said that she had not opened the window and didn't know what he was talking about. That evening, at around 5 PM, when they returned to their home, they found another window open. Over the course of the next 2 to 3 weeks, they would find several windows open in their house with no explanations as to why. During this same time period, while laying in bed watching television at night, Bobby and Lucy started seeing strange shadows moving across the ceiling in their bedroom and in the upstairs hallway. Their dog Eddie would stand at the foot of the bed and growl at the shadows as they glided above him. Never before had Eddie acted like this, and all 3 of them knew there was something really spooky happening in their home, and it seemed to have started after the accident. During the next 2 to 3 weeks, doors in the house would slam shut by themselves, windows would open, and shadows would run across their walls and ceilings. The whole thing was incredibly distressing for the normally rational couple. 3 weeks after the accident, a family member of the people involved in the accident came down from Chicago to tie up some loose ends with the police regarding their deaths. On their way out of town, they stopped by Bob and Lucy's house to thank them for watching over their children on that awful day. Immediately after the relatives visited, the haunting stopped, and nothing like it has ever happened since. Bob and Lucy now firmly believe the spirit or spirits of the deceased family members followed the children into their home and haunted it until they were released by their relatives who visited and followed them back to where they belonged. Either that, or they have moved on to another house in the area. Beaver, Malaga, San Diego. San Diego is celebrated for its idyllic climate, pristine beaches, and an array of family attractions. It's also the home of Beaver, one of our greatly appreciated patrons. For Beaver, we'll be looking at the Whaley House. The Whaley House is an 1857 Greek Revival-style residence and a California historical landmark and museum located in Old Town, San Diego. The house was the former home of Thomas Whaley and his family, and the building was designed by him and constructed of bricks made in his brickyard. As well as being the family home, it also housed a granary, the country courthouse, and various businesses, including Thomas Whaley's own general store. When the family lived there, they experienced a series of tragic events, and these, coupled with the hangings that occurred on the property before the house was constructed, have left the Whaley house with an air of mystery, and added to its reputation as being one of the most haunted buildings in not just San Diego, but the whole of America. Thomas and Anna Whaley moved into the house shortly after they were married, and went on to have 6 children, although sadly Thomas Whaley Jr. suffered from scarlet fever, and on January 29, 1858 died at the age of just 18 months. Just a few months after the baby's death, a fire raged within the home, destroying the general store. Soon after, Thomas decided to move his family to San Francisco. However, in 1868, the Whaley family returned to the home, only to be faced with disruption again, when in 1871, Thomas was away on a business trip, and a group of armed men held Anna Whaley at gunpoint as they seized the courthouse records from the home. A few years later, 2 of the Whaley daughters got married inside the home. Violet, the younger of the 2, married George Bertolacci, and although she gave it her best effort, the marriage was unbearable, leaving Violet divorced and full of despair. Violet never really recovered from the public humiliation and betrayal and suffered from depression. Just a year after the divorce, on August 18, 1885, she committed suicide by shooting herself in the chest with Thomas's .32 caliber. She was just 22 years of age, and her suicide note read, "Mad from life's history, swift to death's mystery, glad to be hurled anywhere, anywhere out of this world." After these tragic events, Thomas Whaley built a single-story frame home for his family at 933 State Street in downtown San Diego, and the family moved into the new residence, leaving the Whaley house behind them. However, it seemed that it was not only tragedies that besieged the Whaley's family whilst living in the house, but they also had a ghost to contend with. His name was Yankee Jim, aka James Robinson, who was convicted of attempting grand larceny in San Diego in 1852 and hanged on a gallows off the back of a wagon on the site where the new Whaley house was built. The local newspaper at the time of the execution reported that Jim kept his feet in the wagon as long as possible, but was finally pulled off. He swung back and forth like a pendulum until he strangled to death. At the time, Thomas Whaley had been a spectator at the execution, although it did not dissuade him from buying the land a few years later and building the home for his family. Although soon after the Whaleys and their children moved in, heavy footsteps were heard moving about the house. Thomas Whaley described them as sounding as though they were made by the boots of a large man. He came to the conclusion that these unexplained footfalls were made by Yankee Jim Robinson. Many years after the Whaley family's brush with the ghost of Yankee Jim, visitors to the house have reported encountering many other apparitions, including the ghost of Thomas Whaley. Usually on the upper landing, one described him as clad in frock coat and pantaloons, whose face was turned away and suddenly faded away as they approached him. Others have seen him as a full apparition standing on the upstairs landing with no colour, just shades of grey, looking more or less like a stone statue. In the old courthouse, the paranormal activity has also been felt, and the chandelier sometimes swings back and forth for no apparent reason. There are footsteps when no one is around, as well as loud crashing sounds, and a man has been heard clearing his throat loudly, as if to let people know he is around. The spectre of Anna has also been reported, usually in the downstairs rooms or in the garden. Other visitors have described seeing or sensing the presence of a woman in the courtroom wearing a long full skirt that appears to be a gingham or calico, small print with a cap on her head. Even the apparition of the Whaley's pet dog, a terrier named Dolly Varden, has been seen running down the hall with his ears flapping and into the dining room. Another presence reported by visitors is that of a young girl who is usually found in the dining room. Legend has it that this is the ghost of a playmate of the Whaley children who accidentally broke her neck on a low-hanging clothesline in the backyard, and whose name was either Annabelle or Carrie Washburn. Although it's worth pointing out that there is no historical records of any child dying in this way at the Whaley house. nor is there a record of any family named Washburn residing in San Diego at the time. Have you ever visited either of these sites, Beaver? And if so, we'd love to hear your experience there. Clitheroe is a small town in Lancashire, England. It is also the hometown of Michael. Michael, as you'll probably know, Clitheroe's most notable building is Clitheroe Castle, although we couldn't really find much on it that suggests it's haunted, certainly not as haunted as the historical Swan and Royal pub. We hope you'll enjoy this one, Michael. The Swan and Royal in Castle Street, Clitheroe dates back to the 1600s and has played host to a raft of famous guests over the decades, including Gandhi, Sir Winston Churchill, and jet engine inventor Sir Frank Whittle. But despite these famous visitors, the pub is most well known for its ghost. For years, the pub has been a magnet for ghost hunters and paranormal experts hoping to catch a glimpse of the tragic young bride, who is alleged to haunt the building. In 1878, soldiers from the 24th Regiment were sent to Clitheroe, which was at the centre of the Cotton Riots. It was during this time that 17-year-old Annie Dunt fell in love with one of the soldiers, and the two were set to be married. However, in 1879, he was sent to what is now South Africa, where he lost his life in the Battle of Isandlwana. Shortly after, Annie found out she was pregnant and was disowned by her family. Overwhelmed by grief, she made her way to the Swan and Royal, where the two lovers had conceived their child, and there she took her own life. Ever since, a distraught Annie has haunted the pub and hotel. Her ghost has been seen on many occasions, always on the top floor. In the guest rooms, duvets are pulled off the beds, windows slam shut, toilets flush randomly, and curtains close by themselves. On one occasion, an American gentleman was having his breakfast in his room when he suddenly became aware of the sound of running water. He looked at the bathroom sink, and the taps were both running, and he watched in amazement as the soap left the soap dish, rotated, and was then placed back in the dish. He then saw both taps turn off by an unseen force. It's said bedroom number 5 is the most upsetting room, as in the past, guests could not sleep as they were constantly being woken by the sound of a crying baby. This went on for several years, until renovations took place in 1957 in the attic above the room. Workmen made a horrific discovery after they found a package wrapped in Victorian newspaper. After they unwrapped the many layers, it revealed a baby skeleton, believed to be Annie's aborted fetus. The newspaper was apparently dated March 1879. Pretty insane. Well, because you live so close to one of Lancashire's most well-known landmarks, Michael, we thought we could not look at this area without mentioning the ghosts of Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Blackpool Pleasure Beach is an amusement park situated on Blackpool's south shore, in the county of Lancashire, northwest England. It's only about 30 miles from Michael's home, and is probably the most well-known landmark in Lancashire. The park was founded in 1897 by a man named Alderman William George Bean, and today is visited by millions of people every year. Although for many years, it's been said that the park is haunted by various spirits of former employees and visitors. One of the most frequent ghostly visitors is a spirit known as Cloggy, who haunts the ghost train ride. Cloggy is thought to be the ghost of a former train operator who was known for wearing clogs. Visitors, as well as employees, have reported hearing Cloggy walking around the ghost train, with the distinctive sound of his clogs clearly heard. Cloggy is well known in Blackpool, and almost everyone who lives or works in the area has heard of him, and those who ride the ghost train may never know if the apparition that jumps out on them is pretend or the real thing. Aside from Cloggy, there is reportedly the presence of a male figure at the park that night workers have frequently encountered, who seems to make his presence felt in the cellar area. According to those who have seen him, he bears a close resemblance to Karl Marx, the famous 19th century German philosopher, who incidentally has no links to Blackpool. In the bar area, a spirit has also been seen walking through in the early hours of the morning. The gift shop is also another hotspot for paranormal activity, with reports of a young girl apparition thought to be about 9 years old, and there have been several instances when objects have been moved around in the shop, and the young girl ghost is said to be responsible. The ice rink is also another well-known spooky spot at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, with reports of the sound of someone skating on the ice when there is no one there. Equipment and lights also move on their own, and doors, which are wide open, have been known to slam shut for no reason. All in all, Blackpool Pleasure Beach not only scares the life out of people with its roller coasters, but you can also get a double fright with all the paranormal activity at the park. Have you ever been, Michael, or have you ever been to the Swan and Royal? And if so, what was your experience like there? So that's it for this episode of Too Close to Home. We'd like to say a massive thank you to the 5 Patreons featured in this video. We hope you enjoyed. We'd also like to thank all the Patreons for allowing us to keep up the documentaries we post over there. If you're interested in watching our documentaries, or want your hometown featured in a Too Close to Home episode, then check out our Patreon. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.